Welcome to the Free Court Show with your host, Jason Hartman. No, Jason's not a lawyer. He's just a regular businessman, a regular consumer. The legal system is broken and most people cannot access it. Jason and his powerful guests are here to help level the playing field so that you, the consumer, can better understand your rights, have options and recourse, and listen to the experts explore new products and services so that you can be an empowered citizen in the system. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome Dean Strang. He is a partner at criminal defense law firm Strang Bradley, adjunct professor at Virginia School of Law, and renowned lawyer in the Netflix hit Making a Murderer. He's also the author of Worse Than the Devil. Dean, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm just fine. Thanks for having me, Jason.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Making a Murderer is just a huge hit, isn't it? Congratulations on your success there.
Well, I didn't have anything to do with it other than showing up in it accidentally.
Well, it seems to have caught on, so congratulations on that. You know, I don't know exactly where we should start with you. Maybe the book. You've got an interesting subtitle to your book about Clarence Darrow, Anarchists, and Justice in the Time of Terror. Tell us a little bit about the book, Worse Than the Devil.
Well, that's my first book. The second one is coming out next year on a larger story, but the first one concerns a state court trial in Milwaukee in 1917 of 11 suspected Italian anarchists. And the book centers on an interest of mine, which is how our criminal justice system treats outsiders, newcomers, especially when the system itself is under a lot of pressure of nativism, fear, just extraordinary external pressures like that, which of course are common during wartime. And World War I is a really good time to look at the operation of the court system under those kinds of pressure. You know, we were in an unprecedented war, and Congress had passed really far-reaching legislation designed to quell dissent in opposition to the war.
Very interesting. Tell us a little bit about the series, Making a Murderer, you know, how that came about, and, you know, maybe just any insights. I'm sure a lot of our listeners have watched the series. It's quite compelling. One of our listeners in particular, I'm thinking of, actually recommended it to me very, very highly, and I watched some of it as well. But tell us a little bit about that.
Shortly after Stephen Avery was arrested and charged in November 2005 with killing Teresa Halbach, two filmmakers who were completing a Master's in Fine Arts degree in New York noticed the story in the New York Times about the arrest of this exoneree and the new charges for murder. They decided to make this their final project in film school and came to Manitowoc, Wisconsin to pursue the story. I think what interested them initially was the question whether some changes to Wisconsin's criminal procedure that had been put in place because of the miscarriage of justice in Stephen Avery's 1985 rape case would help him in the new 2005 murder case. And of course, very quickly, within 4 or 5 months after they got involved, Stephen Avery's nephew, Brendan Dassey, then 16 years old, also was charged in the same murder. So the filmmakers had a broader story by then. My colleague Jerry Buting and I were hired to represent Mr. Avery, 4 months or something after the filmmakers began their work. So when we arrived, filming already was underway and continued throughout our involvement in the case and after. Jerry and I passed the case to appellate counsel. Years went by. Netflix bought the film and presented it in a real long form in 10 episodes. And I think many of your listeners will know the rest of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. No spoilers here, folks. So what insights does our criminal justice system need to learn from that story, or just generally, you hear about these cases where people are wrongly convicted, spend 35 years in jail. Just tragic, tragic stories. What can be done?
Well, in terms of insight, the one that always leads the list for me is the one that maybe I've beaten to death, which is, I think, every actor in the criminal justice system probably could use a dose of humility, or at least every institution that composes the system. Judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, police officers, probation officers, we all could use a bit of humility about the uncertainty that often is left at the end of a case in spite of everyone's best efforts to get at the truth. We also do some things consistently in this country that undermine the reliability of outcomes and undermine our ability to get to the truth. I think important on that list and revealed with Brendan Dassey's experience in Making a Murderer is the continued use of confrontational interview techniques by law enforcement agencies in this country, especially when they're applied to young people or people with cognitive disabilities or learning disabilities. The problems, the unreliability of confrontational techniques of interviewing, I think, are brought home very vividly in Brendan Dassey's experience.
Yeah.
But those sorts of confrontational techniques by police officers are a leading contributor to false confessions and therefore to wrongful convictions.
So, people can have a lawyer present, obviously. I guess the gray area that a lot of people may experience out there if they ever have to have a meeting with the police is when they're not under arrest, when a detective just wants to talk to you. I see that portrayed in TV shows and movies, and that's sort of this part where people can get themselves into trouble. I always worry about incentives of police and prosecutors and their incentives to further their career at someone else's expense, at maybe the expense of their freedom. Pretty scary stuff, isn't it?
It can be. It really can be. And, you point out, Jason, that we all have a right to have a lawyer present when the police talk with us, but you have to invoke that right. Mm-hmm. The police don't have to offer you a lawyer. They don't even have to tell you about that right unless you're in custody. Mm-hmm. Very often the police are good at making you feel compelled to talk with them, even though you are not in custody and, in fact, never would be and never are compelled to provide anything more than your name or your identification in this country. We're the last of the Western democracies to continue to tolerate these sort of confrontational interview techniques that you see applied to Brendan Dassey. The rest of the English-speaking world is migrating very rapidly away from those, or already has. That would be an important change that would increase, I think, the reliability of our outcomes and our ability to get at the truth.
Mm-hmm. DNA has obviously played a very large part in exonerating people and convicting people, thankfully. But is that 100% or not?
That's a little complicated. Look, the science underlying DNA analysis is sound. Now, there's always a question about whether you're applying it well, whether you're avoiding cross-contamination or degradation of samples. But the theory of the science is quite good. Now, in some ways, we have to be careful because our ability to detect very small numbers of nucleated cells and extract tiny, tiny samples of DNA and then expand them for testing has become so good that innocent transfer of DNA through touch, even a sneeze, can be a real problem. But DNA really is the most promising science we have at work in crime labs. When done right, it is the gold standard of the forensic sciences.
Yeah, it really is. I just cannot resist this question. You can pass if you want, but I'm sure it's been asked before. Right about the same time I watched some of the making of a murderer, I watched the OJ series. And it was interesting to kind of relive all that because I lived it in real time when it was going on and, watching it on TV and so forth. I just would, a person like you, what do you think of the OJ case?
I lived it and watched it too at the time and remember it well. I think I was 35 or something when OJ's trial actually happened. I always have supported the jury in that case. I think a fair and reasonable decision was that there was reasonable doubt there. Nobody found OJ innocent, and it may well be that if we could know that he's not innocent. Mm-hmm. But I thought those jurors made a reasonable decision in finding that they had real doubt about the reliability of the case and whether the state proved that O.J. Simpson had committed those two murders beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a high standard that the state has to meet and ought to meet. And I don't think we Americans owe any apology to anyone for setting up the highest possible legal standard before we deprive someone of his liberty or even his life in states that have capital punishment.
Sure. So then I guess the follow-on question to that would be, what did you think of the prosecution in the OJ case? Do you think, with what the jury knew, you support the jury, but with the rest of the case, the judge, the prosecution, there's been, everybody's an armchair quarterback, I know. But it just seems from watching that, and, of course there's, I'm sure, some spin versus reality there. You can't be without it. It seems like there were really a lot of mess ups, and including the police too, It's interesting how you chose your words, by the way. I love how you chose your words. You said, nobody found OJ innocent. I think that was an important statement by someone who obviously knows the law like yourself. It wasn't an innocent verdict. It was just, here's what the jury knew and the decision they made based on what they knew.
Right? Yeah, the verdict was and always is, when there's an acquittal in this country, not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
We err on the side of liberty when we have doubt. As to the lawyers, the prosecutors in the OJ case, look, every lawyer in the world is human. We all make mistakes. I thought that on the whole, that was a talented group of prosecutors. No trial ever plays out perfectly.
Sure.
You're not getting a dress rehearsal. You're doing this in real time or as improv in a sense. And a number of the problems the state encountered in that case really were not self-inflicted wounds by the prosecution. I don't know that they could have known exactly what Detective Mark Furman had concealed in his background, just for example. Now, they made some clumsy errors the way I do and almost every lawyer does in the moment. But on the whole, I thought that was a skillfully prosecuted case and on the whole, a skillfully defended case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. In terms of the system itself, just back to the bigger picture, we talked about DNA. We talked about overzealous police and prosecutors and people knowing their rights. Is there anything else we can do to improve the system we have? How about the outline of the system itself, sort of the architecture of the system? When you look at other countries, even democratic countries that are, seemingly into liberty, as we are seemingly into, I'll say, or at least used to be, they do it differently than we do it. And they're, free societies and reasonable societies. I just thought I'd ask what you think about all of that.
Well, in terms of architecture, Jason, at least in the Western world, there's two basic models. Ours, which is adversarial and rooted in the English common law system. And then what are referred to as inquisitorial systems, largely rooted in Roman law. And I think either can work well. Inquisitorial does not denote, the Spanish Inquisition or other, horrible abuses associated with inquisitions over the centuries. What it refers to is government inquiry into conduct or into facts. And that can require the the cooperation or participation of the citizen, of the person potentially accused. In English-speaking countries, we've always erred on the side of human dignity and human autonomy and said you don't have to cooperate with the government when it seeks to press charges against you or imprison you. You may defy the government. You may stand mute. You may refuse to defend yourself and force the government to carry the exclusive burden of proving your guilt. Now, any of those, either of these models with their many variations can work. I think in terms of the architecture, the biggest mistake we make in the United States is not funding liberty. It's not, providing funding to support that architecture. We badly and disgracefully underfund indigent defense across the United States.
Meaning we don't pay public defenders enough, or
we do not pay public defenders enough, or private lawyers who agree to represent the poor. Mm-hmm. And the poor, people who cannot afford to hire their own lawyer, make up more than 90% of the people charged with crimes in this country, in any state or in federal court.
Right. And not only that, I would argue, and I have a feeling you'll agree with me, that they are prey for law enforcement and prosecutors that want, well, that's both law enforcement, but cops and prosecutors who want to further their careers because they know they're dealing with unsophisticated people that don't have resources, they don't have education, they don't have money, they're just easy, right? You can just get, there's another notch, to my credit if I'm the cops, right?
It's interesting, Jason. I mean, you've articulated a basic truth, which is that there are many forms of poverty, and they tend to overlap. They tend to be related to one another. Mm-hmm. Poverty is not just financial,
right?
The way we usually think about it. You've just described other forms of poverty: poverty of education, poverty of intellect, poverty of life experience,
right? Poverty of connections and network, poverty of the digital divide, as it were, right?
All of that, poverty of mental health, and so you're right. It's easier to convict the broadly impoverished than it is to convict those who are well-educated, resourceful, articulate, and moneyed for that matter. But, the underfunding of the architecture of liberty here in the criminal justice system is grossest on the defense side because almost everybody, 8 or 9 out of 10 charged with a crime, are impoverished. Mm-hmm. But it's also underfunded on the police and prosecution side. We simply don't fund any part of the criminal justice system as if we really care deeply about it and about the liberty that it affects.
You hear of these stories of people who are unjustly prosecuted and imprisoned, and then years later they discover it was a mistake. They discover, okay, the prosecutor committed a crime, the police committed a crime, and maybe it didn't rise to the level of an actual crime, but I'll call it a crime, in what they did to convict this poor guy. Does that ever really come back on them? Does a prosecutor ever get, put in jail and prosecuted for falsely prosecuting a defendant? Or does that ever happen to the cops? Are they like judges in civil matters? You can't sue them. They're pretty much immune. Is there ever a blowback?
It happens so rarely that we read about it every single time it does happen. Mm-hmm. Just like we read about the conviction of a very wealthy person, Martha Stewart, or whomever, O.J. Simpson being put on trial or being convicted later in Nevada. Every time it happens, it is very, very rare for police to engage in criminal misconduct with respect to the justice system,
right,
to be held accountable criminally. It's even more rare for prosecutors or judges to be held accountable criminally, and it's very rare to hold them accountable civilly.
Yeah.
Doctrines of absolute immunity, qualified immunity, these really filter out most of the claims for at least monetary compensation for lives ruined and years lost in prison.
that seems to be where you could make a difference, just changing the law. Every professional has liability for what they do. If you defame someone, if you malpractice on them, as a doctor and you injure them or kill them, you're liable, right? Why aren't these people liable in public positions? They can just hide behind the law and the government, right? They don't have any real personal skin in the game. I think that's the problem.
I agree with you to a very large extent that it is a practical problem. And look, you're right. We've been talking about architecture. If I were literally an architect and I negligently designed a building that collapsed and hurt or killed people,
you would be held accountable. Yeah, I
would be held at least civilly accountable. I would be held accountable for money damages. But if I am a public official, a police officer, a prosecutor, or a judge, and I do something recklessly or even deliberately, often I cannot be held accountable.
Yeah.
And I can tell you the rationale for that immunity, which is that the taxpayer ultimately is on the hook for a judgment to a plaintiff. But, how else do we get taxpayers, get all of us as citizens motivated to insist on better performance from our public officials than if it does hit us in the pocketbook?
Right. But first it has to hit the actual person who did it.
Yes.
They should lose their own money and their own freedom. God, at least they could do community service.
No, I understand, and there simply is not an effective way to hold public officials accountable, even for misdeeds that rise above the negligent.
And they're intentional. Yeah. Interesting stuff. Dean, I've thrown a lot of questions at you. Before we wrap it up, is there anything else you'd like to say? Also, of course, please give out your website. Tell people where they can find out more about you.
Well, people seem to find me easily enough, Jason.
You're on Netflix.
I'm delighted to have a few minutes to talk with you, and I want to thank you for asking me to talk.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, and thank you so much for joining us and shining the light on these important issues. We appreciate it. Thank you, Dean Strang.
Thank you for listening to The Free Court Show. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or the platform of your choice. You can find the show notes and resources for today's episode at freecourt.com. Remember that guests' opinions are their own and information is of general nature, so be sure to consult appropriate tax, legal, and other professionals for specific advice.